Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Understanding the Changes to ISO 9001-2026. Your presenters today are Chad Keimel, Bill Kovachich, and John Shideler. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, I kindly ask that you type them in the chat box, and we will address as many as we can at the end of the webinar. We also encourage all participants to complete the survey afterward. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. If you would like a PDF copy of the presentation or the webinar recording, please contact us at webinars@omnex.com. Chad Keimel is the CTO and founder of Omnex Inc., an international consulting, training, and software organization headquartered in the United States. Chad will be facilitating today's webinar. Chad, I'll hand it over to you for introductions and to get us started.
Hey, Andrew. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I know, we're in different committees from medical devices, aerospace, automotive, everyone is waiting for this 9001-2026. So let's get started to understand the changes to ISO 9001 standards. As you know, the FDIS has come out, and between the FDIS and IS, there will be no technical changes, okay? That is why we're able to do this webinar and also do the transition training. So a quick introduction to Omnex. Folks, many of you might already know who we are, but we typically have people who are coming in new to Omnex. So we are a 900-person organization that is global. We work on many different management systems, including Lean Six Sigma and product cybersecurity. In fact, cybersecurity and TISAX are a big part of the work we're doing today. One of the things we do for our customers is we join these different committees helping write these standards, so when you take our training, it is right up to par. Whether you take our training, you use us for gap analysis, or you use us for implementation, what we offer is right from the source. So it is what we think about as ourselves, a company of thought leaders. So we have 16 offices worldwide. And do you believe it, folks? We're 40 years old and headquartered in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm on the technical committee 176, 207, PC 283. That is QMS, EMS, and OHS, which is health and safety, okay? And something I do, we do a lot of presentations, and I write books. In fact, I'll be updating two of my books, one on integrated management systems and the other on ISO 9001, which will be now, of course, 2026. So this is the agenda of the presentation. Now, Bill Kovachich will continue from here, presenting ISO 9001-2026.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chad. Okay, so we're going to go through, as Chad mentioned, the changes and additions to 2026. Andrew, real quick, sound check. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're coming through really nice. Good.
Okay, good, great. All right, so first, the status of ISO 9001-2026. It is currently in FDIS, Final Draft International Standard. That was released last month. As Chad has mentioned, there are no technical changes allowed after the FDIS, between the FDIS and the international standard being released. So we're quite confident in what we are saying here today will be in the final edition of the standard. Editorial changes are still allowed, but nothing technical will change. The standard is expected to be released this September. Okay, so there are some dominant themes that you'll see in the 2026 edition. So first of all, alignment with the harmonized structure. There are many changes in the text, including reordering, that are driven by the harmonized structure, also known as the high-level structure, to align management system standards. Okay, this is to make it easier for organizations to have an integrated management system if they have common text and have common processes that follow them. So a lot of the changes you'll see in text reordering or in the way and the phraseology that's being used is related simply to alignment with the harmonized structure. Clause 3 now includes 20 common definitions used throughout management system standards, plus 3 more that are unique to quality. There is still ISO 9000, which is the fundamentals and the vocabulary. But these 20 definitions plus the 3 quality-related ones, they are now embedded within the standard itself. Only one of those definitions has changed, and we'll get to that shortly. Quality culture and ethical behavior is probably the most pervasive change you'll see in the standard. And that is quality culture and ethical behavior are now going to be required. It is up to the organization to determine its own quality culture and its own ethical behavior. But that must be established now and communicated throughout the organization. Another change, opportunity-based thinking. The 2026 edition breaks apart opportunity-based thinking from risk-based thinking. And the reason for doing that is organizations tend to focus more on avoiding risk than taking advantage of opportunities. And ISO wanted to elevate opportunities based thinking to the same level as risk-based. So you will now see to where those two terms are separated within the standard, and they each have their own clause. In change management, clause 6.3, you will see some additional requirements there that talk about how we complete the cycle of change. In the 2015 edition, we talked about planning for change and managing that change. Now we're adding additional requirements that will help complete that cycle through the change process. And probably the most significant changes you'll see are enhanced guidance. There aren't a lot of technical changes to the standard, but there are a lot of additional notes added or notes that have been further clarified. And Annex A is now a guidance document, similar to what you'll find in 45,001 and 14,001. So there's a lot more guidance being provided in the application of an ISO 9001. Okay, so now we're going to talk very briefly about changes that you will see throughout the text, mentioned many times throughout the text. Rather than bring them up individually each time, we'll just talk about them once. First of all, documents. In the 2015 version, we used to say maintain documented information for documents and retain documented information for records. Both of those phrases are being changed. For documents, in other words, procedures, work instructions, that type of documentation, that is now going to be referred to as being available as documented information. In other words, have a procedure available when and where it's needed. Have your quality policy available as documented information. When we're talking about records, we're talking about documented information to be available as evidence of. In other words, showing that what was planned was done. Okay. The reason for that change is in some languages that the ISO standard was being translated into, those languages did not have different words for maintain and retain. They used the same word for each. So it was rather confusing in those languages when we were talking about documents versus records. So now we're using the key phrase is be available as evidence of. We'll talk about records. Okay. Also, international standard, a phrase used in the 2015 version, is being replaced with document. Okay, so when we say this international standard, we now simply say this document. Now we'll get right into the key changes and additions to the 2026 standard. In clause 3, as I mentioned before, we have those 23 definitions. Only one definition has changed from ISO 9000:2015, and that is a definition of process, where we add the phrase or transforms inputs to deliver a result. The reason for that addition was to acknowledge that service industries don't necessarily use their inputs, especially if that input is information or a customer requirement, but instead that information might be reconfigured. Okay, so it could be transformed rather than physically manufactured. Otherwise, a rather benign change, but just acknowledging what service industries might do. And secondly, we also include reference now to the ISO online browsing platform and the IEC Electropedia for those terms and definitions, in addition to ISO 9000, which is still going to be a normative reference. In clause 4, we talk about the context of the organization. In 4.1, understanding the organization and its context, we now fully incorporate the London Protocol, which led to Amendment 1 of ISO 9001:2015 in the year 2024, where we talk about climate change as a potential relevant issue for an organization. So it's not really new because of the amendment issued in 2024, but it is now fully incorporated into the standard. There are also notes that help guide the users for how to address that. In 4.2, we support what we just said in 4.1 through an additional note that relevant parties can have requirements concerning climate change. So again, just putting it out there that climate change can be an issue for an organization. In clause 5, leadership and commitment in general, there was a slight wording change when we're talking about top management's leadership roles, in that they are required to support all other relevant roles. In the 2015 version of the standard, we said other relevant management roles. Okay, now we remove the word management and we're talking about all relevant roles. So that is a broader scope. Also, we talk about promoting a quality culture and ethical behavior. It is leadership's responsibility to do that. Again, the organization determines what its quality culture and ethical behavior is, but once that has been determined, leadership now must promote that. And also promote the opportunity-based thinking that we're now emphasizing more in the 2026 version of the standard, along with risk-based thinking. Again, elevating opportunity-based thinking to exploit the opportunities that come along, not just to avoid the risk. In 5.3, we're talking about maintaining the integrity of the quality management system. In the 2015 standard, it said when changes are planned and implemented. Now, with a slight wording adjustment, we're saying that we maintain the integrity of the QMS at all times, not just when changes are implemented. So for most of us, there shouldn't be much of an impact because we were maintaining the integrity of the QMS anyway. But now we're simply emphasizing that this happens at all times, not just when changes occur. Clause 6, actions to address risks and opportunities. Again, with this theme of separating risk-based thinking from opportunity-based thinking and elevating them both, we break Clause 6 into two pieces, 6.1.2 and 6.1.3. 6.1.2 talks about addressing risks, and we now must analyze and evaluate those risks that can have a negative impact to the organization, not just consider and determine them. We also added a note about business interruption as a risk, and this is kind of an outgrowth of the pandemic where there was a lot of supply chain issues we want to acknowledge that business interruption can be a risk that an organization may need to address. In 613, a new clause talks about actions to address opportunities. And again, this is entirely new, so we determine, analyze, and evaluate those opportunities that can provide a benefit to the organization. And we include a supporting note giving guidance on examples of opportunities that may exist. Clause 6.3, planning of changes. We now also consider the availability of information, that is a new requirement, as well as resources when planning the changes. And as I mentioned earlier, we need to now complete the cycle. So once we plan for a change and implement that change, now we also need to consider what we need to do to communicate that change, how we measure the effectiveness of that change, how that's going to be monitored and measured. So we would know if the change was actually a net positive, and how the results of those changes will be reviewed. Okay, so again, it kind of completes the cycle by doing maybe an autopsy, if you will, of the change to make sure that it was a net positive and how we're going to review those results. A few changes in Clause 7 and 7.1.3 infrastructure. We simply just add a note or enhance an existing note that then organizations might also consider the infrastructure required for remote work. Again, kind of a result of the pandemic and everyone working remotely at that time. So remote work considerations might also come into play here when we're talking about infrastructure, as far as connectivity and what we might need to supply to those offsite locations. 7.1.4, we acknowledge that quality culture and ethical behavior can be a potentially influencing factor for a proper work environment. Okay, it's not a requirement, but it does acknowledge that that can come into play. In 7.1.6, we now say organizational knowledge must be applied and shared, not just merely retained. So we're taking a more active approach to make sure that we don't just retain that knowledge, but we apply and share it throughout the organization to make that more effective. In clause 7.3, again, building on the quality culture and ethical behavior, once a leadership or top management establishes that, we now need to make everyone aware of that within the organization. Make them aware of the quality culture and the ethical behavior. Clause 8 in 8.2.1, customer communications. Again, we're talking about business interruption and whether or not we need to provide relevant information about that business interruption. So when communicating with customers, that could be a relevant issue that we need to communicate with them about. When reviewing the requirements for products and services, the 2015 standard talked about when we have new requirements for products and services. When we expand the scope of that now, talk about not just new requirements, but any changed requirements for the product or service that we're providing. So again, a little expansion of the scope there. And in 8.2.4, when those product and service requirements are changed, those changes are communicated to the relevant interested parties. Now, this is a little bit different. This is a little softer than what we used to say when we said that we must make them aware. Well, if we're talking about interested parties, we're talking about entities that are external to the organization, and making an external entity aware of something is really outside of the organization's ability to do that, okay? They need to make themselves aware of it. Where we are concerned as an organization, we need to be sure that we communicate to those relevant interested parties. 8.1 and 8.3 in design and development. Simply, we added notes allowing for the flexibility of the design process so that it can be iterative. So, we may be revisiting some of these clauses afterwards. Not everything is necessarily complete as we step through clause 8.3 from step to step. So we just add notes acknowledging that there could be an iterative process here. 8.3.2, when talking about planning in design and development, we now again expand the scope not just to customers, but to other relevant interested parties. A good example of this might be design for manufacturability. We may need to involve our external providers or our suppliers in the design process and the planning process to make sure that what we might design and then hand off to a supplier, that we involve them to make sure that we're not designing something that's unnecessarily difficult to do. So we want to involve these other relevant interested parties now. In 8.3.6, design and development changes, organizations no longer need to identify the change, just simply determine them. Okay, so a little bit softer language that we no longer have to formally name, that is, identify a change. We just need to determine what those changes are. In 8.4.3, when providing the information to external providers, we also need to consider when those suppliers might interact directly with our customers on direct to customer shipments, things that may not go through us as an organization and go directly from the supplier to the customer. So if there are any requirements related to that, whether it be customers or other relevant interested parties, maybe from a tier 2 supplier to a tier 1 supplier, we need to make sure that we communicate those requirements. And the standard now also acknowledges that verification and validation activities can take place at sites other than the external providers. Again, if we're talking about direct shipment from supplier to customer, that verification and validation may take place at the customer's site, not necessarily the external provider's site. So a couple of expansion of scopes there. Clause 9.1.2, we simply simplified the language, talking directly about customer satisfaction. And we also enhanced the notes with some more examples related to that. Clause 9.1.3, again, going along the theme of elevating opportunities as well as risks. We also talk about effectiveness of actions taken to address those opportunities. In clause 9.2.2, the internal audit program, we now must also define the audit objectives for the internal audit program, not just the reports and the results. And also, the reports are provided to managers, not management, so a slight twist of the word there. But this is suggesting that a more targeted approach to send these audit reports to the relevant managers, not just to management as a whole. So it might be a little bit of an impact for us there. 9.3.2, management review inputs. First of all, the list is now, the list that follows in 9.3.2 are now required, not just taken into consideration. So you can almost consider that list in 9.3.2 to be an agenda, if you wish, for a management review meeting. And those inputs have been expanded to include the relevant changes in needs and expectations of interested parties and the effectiveness of actions taken to address, again, opportunities, not just risk. Okay. In management review results, the word actions was taken out. It is only decisions that need to be included in the results, and that may be because there are maybe cases where actions are not needed. So depending on what that decision is. So now we just talk about the decisions. In clause 10, 10.1, continual improvement. This clause was combined with 10.3. The information was somewhat redundant in both. So we combined the two of them into clause 10.1. and added that monitoring and measurement along with evaluation of data needs to be considered. So you'll no longer see a clause 10.3 in the 2026 edition. And that is it. So, Chad, I believe you're going to pick up with Annex A if your connection is better. Is that, are we
We'll
still
give
doing
it a
that?
second try here, Bill.
Okay.
Sounds better.
All right, good. Can you see my screen okay? All right.
Yes.
So I don't feel I did a good enough introduction to Bill Kovachich. Bill is the Omnex's representative to TC 176. He also is our member to TC 207, which is Environmental Management Systems, and PC 283, which is Health and Safety. And thank you, Bill, for that fine presentation. Take a look at some of the questions that have come up. You may have to answer some of them. Let me continue on to Annex A. Annex A is something new. It is, there always was an Annex A, I'll clear it up, but there never was a section that was explaining sort of what the ISO 9001 intent was. So clauses A1 through A10.2 are a clause-by-clause discussion of the intent behind the requirements and clarifications. Though if you look at it and say, I didn't quite interpret it that way. Well, that's the way to interpret it. But it's not a requirement, it's only guidance. But as somebody who has audited, I managed a registrar also. Very slowly, the annex becomes the way auditors audit. So you should take a look at that, prepare yourself in that manner. So what has really changed is in previous years, 2008 and 2015, the matrix, it was a matrix showing the current and previous versions where everything was mapped. Well, Annex A now is something totally different. So if you saw that, we have about 38 slides in our transition training. I'm just going to cover a couple of them, all right? So you saw some changes in leadership. And this is where how the annex says, what the intent behind leadership and commitment is: support, involvement, and commitment from top management, where they demonstrate, the organization's priority for quality and supporting effective implementation. And I may have mentioned to you, I was a US expert for quality culture, this ISO 10010 that you see in the bottom here, for guidance on quality culture. And it has worked its way now into the ISO 9001. And in the annex, it talks about how top management plays a key role. This is all something we all know, right, from our experiences inside our organizations, that top management plays a key role in establishing and promoting quality culture. Also, ethical behavior. These are some new words coming into the standard. And you can see, the thought that ethical behavior affects all our decisions, actions, interactions, and so on. So I'll just go on here, take a couple of slides. Again, implementing ISO 10010 is not a requirement, but it's cited in ISO 9001. So this is what ISO 10010 says, that we need to understand the organization should use the understanding of its context issues to determine what kind of quality culture do you want, right? Because depending on the industry you're on, what kind of quality culture should you want? And the idea is that we need to understand how top management behaves and what they do, and how you set things up is very critical in terms of what kind of culture we establish in the company. So if you don't have a really good way to define your quality culture, you can look into ISO 10010 for tools and techniques in terms of how you do quality culture. This is one of my favorite areas. Many, many moons ago, we helped Ford Motor Company establish something called QoS, and we used to do something called alignment charts. And that's what these are, aligning the vision, mission, values with the objectives. Of course, we went further. We aligned it to the KPIs and then into the processes that you take from the process map. The idea of identifying the processes that move the needle in terms of the objectives of the company or the intended results. And the idea that you should embed all the quality management principles, and that sort of defines the maturity of the quality culture. All right, so very important section in quality in terms of the leadership's role and quality culture. The second one that Bill mentioned to you was risk. And that, see this here, risks and opportunities can be determined and addressed through separate processes, all right? And that if we go to the very top here, risk is the effect of uncertainty and can have a negative impact on the ability to achieve its intended results. If you think about that KPI that I talked about as your intended result of your, Omnex likes to say BMS, Business Management System, or your QMS, that is the uncertainty, is that risk. And of course, there's also opportunity, and the idea that opportunities can be determined through the assessment of external and internal context, needs and expectations of internal interested parties, then looking inside the organization and identifying our capability, capacity, competence, and looking at the opportunity that we have as a company to meet the overall objectives and the KPIs of the organization. So think of it as maybe two different ways where we'll identify risks and we'll identify opportunities. All right, with that, now let me do an introduction to Mr. John Shideler. John leads a registrar, Omnex Future Past, and I was trying to say this earlier. I don't know if it came through. Omnex Future Past is a registrar that focuses on functional safety, product cybersecurity, and SOTIF, and of course, also on greenhouse gases. John is an expert. He has spent, I'm going to say 20 years, maybe it's probably 30 years, John, where you spent time in TC 207 leading the climate change. And he was instrumental in writing many of the standards we use today. John and I are also both involved in net zero and carbon neutrality standards. And we will be doing a webinar on that shortly. With that, let me introduce John Shideler to you. John, you are mute, sir.
Thank you very much, Chad, and it's a real pleasure to be here from Omnex Future Past. Bill Kovachich has talked about the changes to 9001 that are important for this discussion, which incorporates the amendments from 2024 to the full ISO 9001 standard. And so now organizations need to consider whether climate change is a relevant issue for them. It further goes on to say that relevant interested parties can have requirements related to climate change. And so we think about the kinds of triggers that could result in this determination of relevance. They could be regulatory. It could be a requirement, for example, for greenhouse gas emissions reporting, which could come from a regulation. It could come from customer expectations. Many organizations report voluntarily, for example, to the CDP. Every organization is going to have some kind of physical or transition risks. They may be considered fairly low risk, but they can also be very high risk. And physical risks are the direct operation of changes to the climate, such as extreme heat, flooding, sea level rise, whatever. Transition risks are those that an organization feels when it doesn't adequately prepare for a net zero or low carbon economy. Of course, all the risks that apply to organizations can apply to the supply chain partners. So one of the things that we do, especially in the adaptation field, is we try to map the interactions and dependencies that we have on other organizations so that we can extend our analysis of risk to those key suppliers that we may have in our value chain. Other requirements can come from investors or from customers. We all know how customers have influenced the management system world by requiring the implementation of management systems, whether they're quality, environmental, labor, occupational health and safety, et cetera. So what kinds of actions can organizations take? And this goes back to what Bill was talking about in 6.1.2, actions to address risks, 6.1.3, actions to address opportunities. So you can assess your planned adaptation steps that will help mitigate some of these physical risks. Perhaps an opportunity is to reformulate a product or substitute one product for another to achieve a reduction in carbon intensity and therefore mitigate transition risks. You can commit the organization to net zero carbon emissions and carbon neutrality. This would address the transition risk. You can improve your greenhouse gas emissions reporting, not only to benefit your organization in planning, but also to meet requirements from regulators and expectations from investors. And of course, you can disclose all of this in sustainability reports. I think that does it for me, but do we want to get the next slide?
So I think it's worth talking about, John, that you may just want to briefly talk about the California requirements and also the New York requirements that you and I were talking about.
Certainly. So we have Senate Bill 253 in California, which requires any business with $1 billion of revenue anywhere, but also if it does business in California, it's subject to Senate Bill 253 and must not only count its emissions, but also report on them to the California Air Resources Board. And New York is also implementing from January this year a similar regulation.
I'll just say this, many customers are asking for this reporting so folks do find out, who all have the requirement. Bill, why don't we just talk about the changes here? So Bill is also a representative for 19011. This is this standard has changed. It just got released, I think, last week. And the changes for 19011 will be factored into our not in our transition training, but the internal auditor and the lead auditor training we'll be doing. We'll talk to you about that shortly. So I'm just going to go by this bill and just mention there's ISO 31000 comes up in the ISO 9001 standard. With this standard changing, and maybe I'm part of the aerospace sector, you'll see many more changes in the aerospace sector, and you can expect many more changes in the automotive sector. But this might be an opportunity for us to implement a risk-based standard 3100, and the idea is to be able to use this risk exercise as a strategic advantage. And the 31,000 provides a framework to manage that risk that impact an organization's goal. You can think of it again as intended results. So it is an overall methodology, and you can use it as a way, if you didn't have a way to take all the risks and put it into one overall methodology, 31,000 gives you that opportunity to do that. With that, let me turn things to Bill. Bill, you can work the slides going forward, or I can continue moving the slides for you, okay?
I'll go ahead and take it from here.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so transitioning to ISO 9001 2026. First of all, we need to talk about the transition period. And that is determined not by your registrar, but by the Global Accreditation Cooperation Incorporated, shorthand Global ACI. They are the outgrowth or the result of a merger between the IAF, the International Accreditation Forum, and ILAC, the International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation. Those two organizations merged, formed a company called Global ACI. They are the ones who will decide what the transition period will be, the duration of the transition period, and they have not yet officially announced that yet because the standard has not been released, but it's traditionally been 36 months. It was 36 months between 2008 and 2015. It is 36 months now between ISO 14001 2015 and ISO 14001 2026. So it's expected that we will have the same 36-month transition period from 9001 2015 to 9001 2026. Also, if you are an organization who is just now implementing a quality management system and desires to be initially certified to the 2015 standard, or your recertification is coming up very, very soon, you can still be certified to the 2015 standard even after the release of 2026, but that is going to be shortened. It's likely that a period after about 18 months post issuance of the 2026 standard, that certification bodies will stop issuing certificates to the 2015 standard. So you can still do that for now, even after 2026 comes out, but it's likely that those new certificates won't be issued after a shorter period of time. So what do we need to do to complete the transition to 2026? Well, the first thing is perform a gap analysis. Take the information that you learned here, perhaps in some other courses Omnex provides that offers greater detail of these changes, and compare what your as-is state to your to-be state, and see where gaps are, where we fall short of the 2026 requirements. Also consider things like integrated management systems, digitalization of the QMS, some of these other things that you see listed here about quality culture, risk management that we just talked about. How can those be folded into your new management system? And conduct an executive overview for top management so that they are aware of what's going to happen, the resources that are needed in order to convert to the 2026 addition.
Bill,
Yes.
just to tell our audience, folks, if you are responsible for the QMS, use this opportunity. Standards don't, change. You saw this, it took 10 years to change the standard. Use this opportunity to drive improvement in your organization. Take this opportunity to let top management know there is an expectation for their role of what they should do. Bring in quality culture. I mean, you have to bring in quality culture. It's a requirement. And definitely do an integrated management system. It saves money. And look at digitalization of QMS and AI. Okay. There's so much opportunity. Leverage some of this opportunity in this slide. Go ahead, Bill.
Okay, thank you. After we have identified the gaps, of course, now we need to eliminate those gaps. Update documentation where it might be needed. We may need to tweak some existing procedures or processes in order to meet the new requirements of the standard. We'll need to implement some training of relevant groups and individuals, not just the quality department, not just internal auditors, but those that could be affected by the changes. And implement any other projects based on strategy adopted during the gap analysis. As Chad just mentioned, this is a good opportunity to see how we can incorporate AI into our software tools, how we might have digitalization of the QMS. So implement those other projects if you see the need to do that. Then you want to confirm your implementation with internal audits. You want to go through and audit it yourself, make sure you have all the gaps closed. Once that is complete, you can then complete a transition audit with your certification body. And you can do that at any time. You can do that during one of your recertification audits if the timing works out, a surveillance or periodic audit, or you can simply just schedule it at any time in between if you like. Now, talking about scheduling with your certification body, I remember when we transitioned from 2008 to 2015, and if some of you were around back then, you might remember this too. A lot of organizations waited until the last minute to do their transition audit. And that really taxed the certification bodies because they didn't have enough auditors to deal with that last minute surge in transition audit requests. So I encourage you, don't repeat those mistakes, or especially if you did last time. Try to transition within the first half of that period. You can imagine not many organizations will have their information updated within the first 18 months after the standard has been issued. So think about doing it within that first 18 months. You already have a head start being here today and learning about these changes. Even before the standard is released, you can hit the ground running and start doing that gap analysis, making these changes now. So in order to help that along, where can you go for more information? Well, Omnex offers some courses already. So first of all, the transitions training course, because we know that the technical details of the change are locked in with the FDIS, Omnex already has a transitions course available to you. That is in much greater detail than what we're giving you here in 1 hour. That is a full day course. We also will be offering ISO 9001 auditor training. We cannot yet because of the changes to ISO 19011. Exemplar Global, who certifies our courses, they may change their learning objectives and they may be changing the requirements for the course itself. They won't come to that conclusion until the international standard is released. Once that is done, we will immediately update our auditor training materials and be able to offer those courses.
Bill, the same as, I just want to say one thing, same as we did for the 14,001 training course. Soon as Exemplar came up with their requirements, because we're accredited to Exemplar, folks, within weeks, we updated our course. And right now, somebody asked me at 9001, our 14,001 training is available globally. I'm going to answer a question that was asked earlier about what should an auditor do? So, folks, I would say an auditor who just recently went through 9001 2015 or one of those other ones can take the transition training. If it's been 3 years or more than 3 years since you took an auditor course, my suggestion would be to take either internal auditor or lead auditor. That would be the Omnex's position and guidance for that. Go ahead, Bill.
Here's a brief outline. We're not going to go into a lot of detail here, but this is the outline of our transitions course and who would be an appropriate attendee of this. Not just, well, basically your quality management systems managers, practitioners, auditors, an implementation team that might be tasked with updating your QMS and improving your QMS to the 2026 requirements. Those are the people for which this transitions training is geared to. And you can see in the outline itself, we go into a lot more detail on not only the changes, but the intent behind the changes and what the anticipated impact of that change could be to your organization. So again, if auditors will likely need to complete the transition training, but it's not just for auditors. It could be for anyone involved in the quality management system itself.
Could be implementers.
Yes, implementers and practitioners. Yes.
Though we also will have an understanding course. I'll just say this, Bill. We don't need to wait for exemplar rules to come out to be able to do the understanding course on site or to do a gap analysis. Go ahead, Bill.
That's correct. Okay, so we have some upcoming transition training classes. June 15th, next week, I'll be teaching that one. We also have some set up for, as you can see, June, July, August. So feel free to take advantage of these opportunities to get that transition training now. We are still offering 9001 2015 auditor training, again, for those organizations who might be in the throes of implementing a QMS for the first time, or maybe having a turnover in their auditor core. So we do still offer the 2015 version of that training. But as you can see on the note on the right-hand side, we can do gap analyses, we can do executive overviews, transitions training, understanding training. We can do that to the 2026 version now. So you don't have to wait. It's only for the full suite of the internal and lead auditor course where the changes to 19,011 will impact that part of those courses that we need to wait for Exemplar Global. Okay,
So maybe I can do some of these slides,
sure.
Bill. You can just
Sure,
drive
I'll go
if you
ahead and
don't
run.
mind. I want to just mention, Bill and I are doing a 14,001 webinar. It's on, I think it's June 19th, it is. And folks, somebody asked about digitalization. What do we mean by digitalization? I'll mention that to you in a second, okay? Hang on, I've got this pop-up that's taking up my space here. All right, let me see. I don't know how to close it. Let me close it. Okay, I did close it. All right, so this is the Enterprise Quality Management System Suite. It's an AI suite. So we actually do AI for FMEAs. We do AI using Problem Solver for 8Ds and also for audits. And we're bringing in a lot of AI in the next few months. Go to the next. Can you hit a return? So these 14 modules are modularized into new product introduction, into enterprise AI or QHSE AI. We have a supplier quality management, and we also have an e-mobility, which is functional safety, cybersecurity, and A-Spice. We can go to the next slide. Next slide, if you don't mind, please. Okay, go ahead and hit return again. So this is the 4 different platforms. So the idea of digitalization is taking all the data that you have and making it digital. Whether it's new product introduction, it's quality data, all the data that you have, all your supplier data will be digital. So actually, if you have digital data, you actually can do AI on it. Let's go to the next slide. So we have, what we call the Omnex OBot built into our software that does validation, recommendation, prediction. And today we are starting into doing generative AI. For example, we can actually use LLM, large language models, to generate FMEAs. And also the LLM is helping us. We're not generating PPAPs, of course, but we can review. I wanted to say audit, but that wouldn't be the right word. Review a PPAP and give all the findings. It's a very tough thing to do. So the AI is it's getting to be so clever. Go to the next slide. These are all the AI. Go ahead and hit a couple of returns, sir. Here's all the different solutions we have, from audit management, FMEA, problem solving, PPAP reviews. I'll just say for those of you who have to do a V model and come up with the requirements on the left and the test cases on the right, we actually use AI to generate it, really, really saving a lot of money on product development. Go to the next slide, sir. A lot of questions. I want to get to the questions here. Oh, there we are. So with that, let's start here. We have a question, Bill, on opportunity-based thinking, whether it is triggered from risks. I have an answer, but I'll let you answer and I'll add to your answer, okay? Or if you want me to take it on, I'm happy to do it.
Sure. Is it triggered from risk? It could be. It could be that addressing a risk may lead to an opportunity.
Uncover an opportunity. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So yeah, it could uncover an opportunity either directly related to the risk or related to or indirectly related in another part of your quality management system. So yes, it could.
But also on the same time, though, that should not be the only opportunity-based process. You should look at your interested party expectations. You should look at your context, and then you should look inside the organization and see how you could leverage with the kind of situation, the context you're in, what kind of opportunities presents to yourself, and you can come up with a separate also opportunity-based process. Yes, indeed, risks will uncover opportunities, but opportunities should be thought of by itself. Okay. Go to the next one. September is the change date. Any training certification in South India, we will have a course for you, possibly even before September, if Exemplar comes out with its requirements. How many weeks did they take for 14,001? Do we know? Soon as they come out with the requirements from Exemplar, we will have that training, possibly even before that. And right now we're offering global 14,001 2026 training. We'll do the same for 9,001. Should we go on, sir? Should we expect the external auditor to provide their audit objectives? I don't know if that's what you meant when you talked about audit objectives. If yes, external auditor will know to audit their objectives, not their expectation. Do you want to just answer that and clarify this listener? Or did I confuse you? They're thinking something you said triggered in them the idea that the external auditor needs to provide audit objectives. I don't think the standard is saying any of that, right?
No, that pertains to internal audits that we need to now provide audit objectives. And honestly, that is probably something that organizations do anyway. It's just now being formalized within the requirements. But
Make sure
that
you
does
do that,
not.
okay? Audit objectives and scope. Okay. We trained that. So if you attended our training, please go back and look into your notes. Shall I go on, Bill? I'll take this
If we
next
got time,
one.
yeah.
Yeah, we'll take a little bit more. We'll go a little over. We're 45,000, 14,000, and 9,000 certified. I would like to scope out my environmental manual. What they want to do is put down in the, I think this is what they're saying, all this climate change is in the 14,001. So just to answer you, that cannot be a blanket answer. You need to put down your interested party expectations. We would expect that in your interested party expectations for the QMS. But as you said, it could be handled in 14,001, but would behoove us to make sure you have handled it, especially if you're doing integrated management system and it's the same auditor, they could definitely check that out, okay? So I don't know if I answered you. Yes, you can scope it out, but you'll still need to at least have the interested party expectations, okay? Are you okay with that answer, Bill?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. How can I'll pass this on to John. John, how can we identify specific cost factors caused by climate change in a given organization? It seems quite difficult.
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly there's a source of information is classic risk management strategies, including asset management. We know after the Superstorm Sandy in New York that a lot of people realized they needed to move their electrical transformers and systems to a higher floor from the basement. That's one type of asset management, risk management. On the adaptation side, the ISO has some really good standards, 14,090 and 91, to help organizations with that. And of course, we can also assist with some consulting.
So here's a one for maybe I don't see registrars auditing regulatory requirements. Do we anticipate this changing? What do we all think? I mean, I think auditors should be looking at, they should audit regulations, but they should make sure that regulations are considered, regulatory requirements are considered inside the organization. You can chime in. We auditing regulations. Am I breaking up again, folks?
Yeah, you're breaking up again.
Oh my gosh. Okay. All right. Shall we do one last question, folks? Hopefully you can still hear me. Quality culture, should it be documented? What would it look like? How to audit quality culture? I will just say this. I don't think there's any guidance in ISO 9001 on quality culture. Is there, Bill?
Not really. As I mentioned, it's basically it's up for you to determine what your quality culture is, and it's already recognized as being, well, I'll say pretty squishy as far as being able to audit that. Just like there were lots of things in the 2015 standard that we kind of struggled with auditing until we got a better handle on it as the years unfolded. So the Inquisitor is right. This is going to be hard to do, but
I'll give you some of my
the
thoughts also,
organization.
Bill.
What's that?
I'll give you some of my thoughts also on that,
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think soon maybe the IAF, did I get them right? Will come up with some sort of a guidance, I think, on quality culture, don't you think?
I expect more to come. Don't know.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
not been talked about, but I expect it to.
As a US expert on quality culture, yes, I am looking for, and also somebody who sits on TC 176 and has audited ISO 9000, both as a third party, auditor and so on. I would expect you to have something documented on what you call the quality culture, okay? And how leadership is promoting. Is that the word they're using? Promoting quality culture? And and what you're doing internally on the quality culture is something I'd be looking for, okay?
And
So, yeah,
where we
go
might
ahead.
be able to see that is through what's called the APG, the Auditor Practicing Group.
Ah,
Uh, they write papers on how to audit certain things, and I'm sure that once the standard is out, after it's soaked for a while, you can check the ISO 9001 or not the ISO website, but the TC 176 website and look for a paper on that under the APG.
so this might be something, Bill, TC 176 could maybe be one of the earlier questions to answer. What do you think?
Probably. I'll take that to the next meeting to run that up the line to the TC.
Folks, with that, um, thank you very much for attending this webinar. I hope you found this value added. It is our pleasure to be able to do this for you. Big thanks to Bill Kovachich and John Shideler. And on behalf of Omnex, thank you very much for attending and hope to see you in future webinars. Bye-bye now.